So it's October 2nd, 2014, and this is a video that I'm making to reflect on chapters 1 through 5 of Erik Malewski's book, The Next Moment, and also some articles that we're reading in the curriculum theory course this fall. So we've asked each of the students in our class to pick a theme that they think runs throughout the first 5 chapters of Malewski's book, as well as the 3 articles that we've selected for this week as we move into discussing the future of the curriculum studies field. And so those 3 pieces are Petra Monroe's piece from 1996 on resisting resistance and talking about female teachers, Kathleen Weiler's piece from the Harvard Educational Review called Frere and Feminist Pedagogies of Difference, and Elizabeth Ellsworth's piece, also from the Harvard Educational Review, Why Doesn't This Feel Empowering? Working Through the Repressive Myths of Critical Pedagogy. So I think that my theme from the opening quote is this idea of reading and rereading. And for those of you who know me, you know that I am a very voracious reader. I enjoy reading a lot. And I also am a big theory person. So I think that these first 5 chapters and these articles are all asking us to think about the next moment of curriculum theorizing, the next moment of educational theory, being rooted in this idea of reading and rereading the field. And I think that happens in multiple ways, right? So I think for chapter 1 of the Malewski text, which is the introduction, the thing that, or the portion that really sticks out to me is this idea of involved theory that Dr. Malewski talks about. And the reason that this strikes me as so important is because I think that Dr. Malewski is asking us to not necessarily forego reading theory, but for thinking about reading theory in a different way and engaging with discourses and theoretical frameworks that maybe we're not familiar with in our own day-to-day work. And of course, in my own work as a PhD student, I'm trying to bring into the discussion, both in the field of student affairs as well as curriculum theorizing, the ideas of complexity theory. And I'm using that a lot in my dissertation and in some of my other work. And I also think Dr. Malewski is asking us to reread the historical figures in the field, ensuring that we're not ahistorical, but also that we're not glorifying the past and not looking over maybe some contentious issues that we need to deal with in the past. And I think this is also an issue that gets brought up in Jennifer Gilbert's chapter, which is chapter 3, correct? So Gilbert is using the psychoanalytical perspective to ask us to think about reading differently, reading the past differently, right? And so she has that big section in the middle of her chapter where she's talking about the importance of reading, where she's talking about the intimate connection between how we read and what we read, and the intellectual traditions of the past and the future. And I think that that's a really important part of that chapter. I think Nathan Snanza is also talking about this in his 13 Theses chapter, correct? He talks about the importance of, for example, reading Dewey, that we oftentimes say that we understand Dewey, but we haven't really engaged in a very careful reading of John Dewey, and we don't continually return to him. We just kind of see John Dewey as a ghost, right? But he thinks that reading and rereading these individuals is important and necessary, and I think that he frames this as part of our ethical obligation in order to be good scholars in the field, is to continually reread and to rethink, but not necessarily with the intent of interpreting, but rather just dwelling, right? So this quote at the beginning that I selected, questioning and reading are not methods, they are ethical modes of dwelling. This is Nathan's contribution to this discussion for me personally, this idea that we don't necessarily need to interpret the text, but we need to just dwell in the text, and that that's our ethical obligation. I think for both Rubin and Molly Quinn in chapters 4 and 5 of the first 5 chapters of Dr. Malewski's book. They're asking us to reread some different concepts, right? So Rubin is asking us to reread the idea of solidarity and what does it mean to be in solidarity. And of course, this was a topic we explored in Michael Apple's book, Can Education Change Society? What does it mean to be in love, care, and solidarity in the educational process, for example. But he also asks us to rethink and reread this idea of these chasms that we have arbitrarily set up, right? He calls them uh, bogus chasms, or whatever the case is. And so he says that we need to rethink this chasm that we've set up between theory and practice, or art and science, right? That these are actually not real divisions, but that they actually are integrally and intimately integrated, right? So theory and practice are integrated, art and science are integrated. And I think Molly Quinn is asking us to reread space, right? So are the spaces of our classrooms and our universities, are they hospitable to difference and to people who come into our environments that might be a little bit different? Finally, in the 3 articles that we selected, so the Kathleen Weiler piece as well as the Elizabeth Ellsworth and the Monroe piece, I think we have 3 different interpretations of rereading foundational work in the field that will bring us into the next moment, or the post-reconceptualization. So Ellsworth, reflecting on the writing of foundational writers in critical pedagogy and theory, for example, Henry Giroux, Michael Apple, Peter McLaren, Aronowitz, and even Paulo Freire, suggests that we need to reread foundational words, for example, voice, empowerment, dialogue, and even the word critical, as reproducing oppression through the formation of mythologies. Her solution, which I think is also echoed by Malewski in his introduction to the Next Moment book, is to embrace a pedagogy of the unknowable. Doing so recognizes that we can never know fully another's experience. And allow me to state here that I love Elizabeth Ellsworth's phrase in her article that all knowing is partial. I think Kathleen Weiler, in my opinion, is using this idea of involved theory that I talked about at the beginning of my little video here to reread Freire and critical pedagogy. So in this piece, she's attempting to state that by reading Freire through a feminist lens as an involved theoretical reading forces us to rethink some of the Freirean notions of critical pedagogy. For example, the role of the teacher, or rational reason as the only source of knowledge, right? That we might also think of other sources of knowledge, for example, feelings and psychic sorts of forms of knowledge, right? As well as the role of difference. And I think for those individuals enrolled in EDCI 7901 this fall, we've talked a lot about feminist and gender perspectives on curriculum, and we traced some of the tensions that arose in the feminist movement over the last quarter century around this idea of difference. And I think that Kathleen Weiler is also talking about this. And finally, I think that Dr. Monroe, in her piece on resisting resistance, is trying to think about how we can reread this dominant narrative of Marxist and neo-Marxist theory, which is the reproduction and resistance ideologies and models that we've talked about in class. And I think she's asking us to rethink how we formulate the idea of resistance, right? And so she says in her piece, and she uses these interviews from female teachers, that resistance is a movement and it's continual, right? That it's not just an act. And so I think that in some of her analysis of how these female teachers resisted patriarchy, resisted oppressive structures in the environment, what Dr. Monroe is asking us to do is to think of resistance not as something that occurs just sort of fleetingly in tiny moments or in 1 or 2 acts, but that we're continually having to work at resistance. And I think that this is also something that Kathleen Weiler, as well as Elizabeth Ellsworth are trying to say in their pieces. So to wrap it all up, my theme is reading and the importance of reading. And I think that in all of these pieces, we are challenged to be involved with theory in very critical ways, not necessarily always having to just interpret the theory, but to dwell in the theory and to be comfortable in the ambiguities and the questions that come up, and allowing that to inform our pedagogical practice as well as our curriculum theorizing. So my theme was reading, and hopefully you enjoyed this short video. Thank you so much.